Here we are. Okay. So a reminder, the session will stop at 9:30, and the Chatham House rule applies, which means you're free to share the concepts or issues that are raised today, but please let's not share who said what or which organisation is associated with the comment or concept. So on that basis, thank you very much again for attending, and I'm going to pass to Janet.
Thanks, Russell. So as Russell and as the slide says, I've spent 30 years, over 30 years now, it gets quite scary numbers, working mainly in professional services, but also in banking and some time in the public sector and manufacturing as well. Half of that was part-time, and I also took a couple of breaks to look after my children. 2016, I left professional services and set up my own coaching and HR consulting business and started a master's in coaching and behavioural change at Henley Business School, which was part-time. And as part of that, I did this research. I'll come back to that. I spend a lot of time now, obviously, working as a coach, but also I volunteer particularly for future generations. So I've been a school governor for 12 years. And I volunteer with other schools as well. So I'll start the presentation now. If you could keep questions until the very end after the breakouts, that would be great, but there'll be opportunity to ask questions at that point. Okay. So when I started my research, there was a question raised by, is this still an issue? Why are you looking at gender issues when there are many other issues around? But the headlines that are about to appear from the Financial Times indicate that it is very much still an issue. These are all headlines from this year. Moving on, it's clear that we've done a lot. Organisations and the government have done a lot to improve women's lot in organisations. But despite everything that we've done, you'd probably be familiar with the Women in Finance Charter, some of you, and the 5-year review that's just come out shows that although numbers of women on executive committees proportion of women has increased, it's still only 22%. McKinsey, they keep finding this each time they carry out this research, and they do this diversity research pretty frequently, or pretty well every year. In 2019, which is the latest research they've done, they found again that companies in the top 25% for gender diversity are 25% more likely to outperform on profitability. So that's the carrot, if you will. And then we've got the stick of the overall gender pay gaps, which we know aren't great, as well as the Women in Finance Charter findings. So there's still a lot around showing that there's still a lot to do. So today then, we're looking at what helps women's journeys and what hinders their journeys. Now, this is what I found. So I did this, as I mentioned earlier, as part of my master's. These interviews were carried out before COVID, face-to-face, pretty well, nearly all of them, which meant hopefully I was able to get quite an honest response. Not saying that Zoom doesn't, but I felt I got an honest response from those I did speak to. And the majority, I'd say 95%, had reached partner level in the past 2 years in professional services. And it was a cross-section, so accountants, lawyers, and consultants. But what did I find? The key influences that I found are very much dynamically interlinked with one another, both positive and negative. So although I've split them into these 3 areas of social and environmental as the external resources, and the inner resources, the characteristics that people have, nonetheless, and as I go through this will probably become clear, they are very closely interlinked, and it's very difficult to split necessarily any of them apart from the other. There are also a couple of, this being academic research primarily, although obviously there's a very big practical element to it. There were a couple of theories that I brought in. But the first one is a little bit like compound interest, if you like, cumulative advantage, or often in other contexts, disadvantage theory, saying that if you start with a small advantage, that compounds over time into an ever greater advantage. And that helps individuals' self-belief and fosters their adaptability and resilience, and I'll go more into that. The other theory that I was able to bring in was in neuroscience, which is becoming, as you'll all be aware, I'm sure, more and more important in psychology. But it showed that young people's brains developed and prepared them better for leadership roles if they took on early leadership responsibility. Perhaps that's obvious, but giving people those early opportunities really does seem to make a difference in my research too. So to the findings. So there's some quotations around the edges of what people said. But here, I guess the key for me is probably the second one down, which is very closely linked to the first point, which is sponsors. So sponsors are very important, whether these sponsors are, and generally these sponsors are informal sponsors, but they're very important, or were very important to these women. In fact, still are. Even in the early days of partnership, perhaps especially in the early days of partnership, these sponsors are very important to these women, and these sponsors gave the women recognition and affirmation. And the consequence of this, and we'll come to this later, is the self-belief, the self-efficacy that these women then developed because of that recognition and affirmation. But there are other groups that women found particularly helpful, their peers. The teams that worked around them were very supportive and helped take some of the burden whilst they particularly in the year that they were applying to become partner, or the 2 years it usually is to apply to become partner. But also their informal networks, and inevitably, and I think all the women bar one had children, so support at home with children was also particularly important, whatever form that took. On the other side of the equation, there was quite a lot of unintentional bias that women felt they had experienced. For example, one woman spoke of judgments being made around her childcare decision to come back after her third child after 3 months of maternity leave, because by then she was a new partner and she's worried about the business that she built up while she'd been away. The words aggressive rather than assertive being used, and that's been around for a long time. And one woman mentioned, for example, regular meetings at 8 AM, which really didn't fit with her schedule. Some meetings at 8 AM fine, but not regular ones. And the other point that a couple of people made was they may not be aware of course, bias. You're not always aware of bias either. So there may be things here that people weren't aware of, but those points that I've just brought up were those that they were aware of. And the lack of role models was mentioned, which I think that's changing in some organisations, but all the women said there was, and this is perhaps inevitable, there was no one that they saw particularly as a role model, but they took parts from individuals to build the role model that they wanted to have. And formal networks were difficult for women. One woman talked about a wall of men's backs when she walked in to one of the networking meetings. Okay, so the next set of influences are the environmental ones. This is where I've brought in early opportunities. They really come in everywhere, but they are really, really important to give people opportunities. And it's also important, and I'll come back to this, for women to seize these opportunities. So the women generally I spoke to had seized these opportunities when they presented themselves. They'd taken risks. And there's quite a lot of research separate to what I found about the fact you do need to take risks. You do need to try things out. Seize the moment effectively. Flexible working culture. Women definitely felt that had helped them because they were able to leave work at, say, 5:30, 6 o'clock and then log on later at home. And I think you'll all be aware that in the banking environment, for example, professional services, it's a very demanding environment, and it's good to be able to have that flexibility. Interestingly, the disadvantages were generally once people had reached partner level, in that they felt, or as they were getting to partner level, the process to get there and the support once they became new partners seemed to ebb away completely, and they were sort of left to get on with things. I think a lot of women found that quite difficult. I was asked whether client expectation had been raised as an issue by any of the women, and actually it wasn't raised as an issue by women. In fact, women said that clients were often more understanding than the businesses they worked in as far as expectations were. And often a lot of the businesses were able to support the women to say, have a day off a week, but be flexible within that day. So generally, in fact, no one raised that as an issue. All that was said was clients actually often have lower expectations than your own organization. And a few more quotations. So the final set of influences are the inner resources, so your own personal characteristics, but these are inevitably linked to the experiences that you have. So out of the women I interviewed, the 17, 15 mentioned that they felt they had lower confidence levels than others around them. So I think there was actually a webinar by Leading Figures a whole year ago now, but I think it's still on the website, about imposter syndrome that Jane helped lead. And I recommend you go back to that if you want to find out more about this. But self-belief and confidence is clearly fundamental to these women, and their self-belief was fostered by sponsors. And in fact, this early responsibility with support. So it's an iterative process. So they developed the adaptability, the resilience, the tenacity was all fostered by this early responsibility. The fairness point is women felt that they were working hard, but weren't necessarily being credited for what they were achieving. So at that point, a number of them talked about how they suddenly realized they had to raise their profile. They had to make sure people knew what they were doing, and that hard work wasn't enough. But there was a real wish from most of them to remain true to themselves as part of that. Okay, so the others it's the other side of the spectrum, basically the things that don't help. So quite a lot of interesting quotations here. I had very, very many I could have used. So then moving on to suggestions. So for organisations, I've pretty well covered this already. So early stretch opportunities are very important, but with support and affirmation and recognition. A number of the women mentioned how they would have liked more career advice coaching at an earlier stage. And I know that's not always feasible for some organisations, but group coaching, a couple of people talked about group coaching and how that had been helpful at this point. The culture, it's very important that the culture is created that supports women at all stages in their careers from the start, starting as on a par with men, and ensuring, and this applies to men and women as well, that they reach their career potential, particularly if they're working flexibly. So for example, if women take a year off for a career break, that's then they can then catch up over perhaps a year later than their peers might have done. Giving more profile to female leaders, putting more reliance on female values and recognising hard work and what that's bringing in. And then inevitably data on gender, but actually looking ahead at what the pipeline's giving you on gender. And then for individuals, the recommendations are to, hoping that the my glamorous assistant, there we go, thank you, that the key recommendations for individuals are to develop self-awareness. That's really important, and coaching, inevitably, as you'd expect, I'd say that helps, given an external perspective there. Seize those opportunities, look for sponsors, ensure people know what you've achieved, find some role models, but finally, of course, and I always used to say this to people before their interviews, for partner and director, be true to yourself. That's who the organisation's looking at. Okay.